This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon.
Last year, the Enjoyer Podcast was the first in Michigan to say the thing. She's running. She being our governor, Gretchen Whitmer. When the Enjoyer Podcast started, President Joe Biden had just put on the worst debate performance in U.S. history. Check out some of the highlights here. You've never seen anything like it. Hopefully, you'll never see anything like it again from a sitting president.
To do with the with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death.
I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
When Democrats made a deal with the devil in 2020 by rallying around Joe Biden as the consensus pick, by stuffing the ballot box with 81 trillion votes, it was on the explicit understanding that Biden would be a one-term president. But a funny thing happened when Biden felt power in his hand. He didn't want to give it up. After 50 years of various proximity to the throne as a senator or as a vice president, now the throne was his. He liked the way it felt and he decided he wanted to keep it. Nobody wants to admit that they've made a deal with the devil. Joe Biden, an allegedly devout Catholic, certainly didn't. So what do you tell yourself instead? What Joe Biden told himself last year when he chose to break his one-term promise and run again. You tell yourself that you're the only man who can win. You remind the world that you won 81 trillion votes as an old man in his basement in 2020 against a popular incumbent. You ask anyone to dare any other Democrat, dead or alive, who could have done the same thing. You start to believe your own hype. Only I can save America. Only I can save our democracy. Then on the debate stage, reality set in. Hop in your mental time machine with me. Think of a time you've ever seen a presidential debate happen in June ahead of the conventions of both parties. The rule of thumb in election world is that the election starts in earnest after Labor Day. So a June debate was an oddly early timing of things. And I'm not the first Republican to suggest that the timing was set up so that what happened would happen. That Biden would fail, and then the case could be made that he should be replaced, and then he would be. And then Biden did fail, as badly as anyone we've ever seen fail. So badly that Kamala Harris, as vice president, and Gretchen Whitmer, as campaign co-chair, should have faced tough questions about his condition. We were in a situation where America's chief executive didn't know who he was or where he was. The best time to act on that was when Biden's condition was first discovered. Years of our lives could have been salvaged. Billions of dollars could have been salvaged. The worst time is after he ruined the country for 4 years and then dies on the stage in a televised debate. For Democrats, it was the worst of times after Biden's debate fail. But for Whitmer, it was an opportunity. It's no coincidence that Whitmer's book, her memoir, True Gretch, was set to release just after the oddly early debate. Right when the conversation about who should replace Biden would heat up and be loudest, here would be Gretchen Whitmer. Here would be True Gretch on the couch of every late night show. Right when Democrats would need a hero with a national profile, here would be Gretchen Whitmer on the tip of every tongue. It was a good plan on paper, but every football coach in America would tell you that the game is not about X's and O's. It's about Jimmys and Joes. A playbook is just a picture book without the players to make it happen. So the Whitmer plan was a good one. And then actual Gretchen Whitmer, the actual human being, was sent out to run the plays. And that's where everything went left. Even in his old age and poor health, Biden could see Whitmer coming. And so on July 4th, he flew in Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, to work a fundraiser on Michigan's west side. Whitmer was not invited or present. She was outside the circle of trust. Whitmer then escalated. She took to the airwaves on CNN and said it wouldn't hurt if Biden submitted to cognitive testing, handing Donald Trump another win he did not need. Those words would have hurt coming from any Democrat, but here was Biden's campaign co-chair throwing him under the bus on national TV. The knives were out, but the problem is Whitmer had a dull blade and she wasn't skilled at wielding it. In a sense, events saved her from the humiliation that might have resulted if Whitmer actually got her wish. Due to events, due to an attempted assassination in Butler, Pennsylvania, for the second time in 2 election cycles, the winds of history would deny Whitmer a date with destiny. 3 days after Biden tossed Whitmer under the bus, Trump was shot in the head. He survived, and then a week later, Biden dropped out of the race. It's not an exaggeration to say that America avoided communism by 1/4 of an inch. There would be no primary to replace Biden. There'd be no microwave primary. There'd be no scramble. Just a few tweets and a Zoom call where Kamala Harris, vice president and heir apparent, was elevated to the top spot in a $1 billion enterprise. But why was Harris the VP in the first place? Let's go back to the summer of 2020. At that point, Whitmer looked every bit a worthy running mate to Joe Biden. Between the spotlight of the COVID pandemic, between Trump's anti-endorsement calling her that woman from Michigan, Whitmer had a high profile, and it would have, had she been picked, only rose higher later that year. It was a month before the election. The October surprise should have been the Hunter Biden laptop, but that was suppressed by every outlet and social media outlet on the planet. So instead, it was the Whitmer kidnapping. Now imagine had Whitmer been on the Biden ticket and been able to say she was the victim of a kidnapping plot that traced back, at least in the media's telling of things, to Donald Trump and his mean tweets. That would have been perfect, but history would say otherwise. Years later, Whitmer herself would admit that she was never in any danger. There was no kidnapping plot. Today, years later, the plot is widely understood as an FBI psyop. After Trump has been shot, Whitmer, I don't think she's mentioned it once, and she spent little time in her memoir on it. Why would she? She never faced any true danger. But that's not what we thought in October 2020. In October 2020, that's the kind of thing that would have made Whitmer just so much bigger of a star had she actually been the VP at that moment. Everything looked good for Whitmer in 2020, and then Memorial Day came. Then George Floyd died in the hands of Minneapolis police and was soon elevated to sainthood. One statue that was built in honor of George Floyd actually depicts the counterfeit bill that he passed that got the cops called on him. One account of history tells it that George Floyd handed off that $3 bill to buy some of the books he was going to need at Harvard that fall when he enrolled. I've not been able to verify this account. And so in the spirit of the times and in honor of George Floyd, Biden announced that he wouldn't just pick a woman as his vice president, which would have been Whitmer. He'd pick a black woman. Seeing as there's not many of them in politics, so you have Stacey Abrams, not exactly an attractive woman, Cori Bush, the same, and Michelle Obama, who the only time I've ever seen her smile was the night her husband was elected president. So not a great group, not a very telegenic group. You ever watch golf? I remember watching golf one time during the Tiger Woods era and thinking, well, they keep talking about Tiger Woods, but what about this other guy who's a brother out there? And I thought that Vijay Singh was black until I heard them say his name. That's what Biden tried to do with Kamala Harris. Biden named Vijay Singh as his running mate, but tried to pass her off as Tiger Woods. A simple look at Kamala Harris's turkey neck would have told Biden and anyone else who looked the real truth. Her black had cracked in a manner unnatural to a black woman of that health and that success. There was only one possible explanation why. There was no black to crack. Kamala Harris was only black-ish. But in 2020, black-ish was black enough. With some black salt sprinkled on his ticket, the ghost of Joe Biden won 81 trillion votes and the presidency. But if you live by DEI, you will die by DEI, and that's just what happened 4 years later. A 50-year politician, after getting his time on the throne, after feeling the scepter and the power in his hand, refused to relinquish it. He refused to honor himself and his word and his good name. He betrayed the Democrat Party. He tried to run twice after saying he'd run once, and then he was betrayed by the Democrats. But if Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama could force Biden out, they couldn't control what he would do next. By naming his vice president as heir apparent, Democrats were stuck with Kamala Harris atop the 2024 ticket. Look, history was not always this way. You look at FDR, I think he was kind of the last one to do it. FDR had 3 vice presidents during his 4 terms as president. The guy he started with in 1932 is not the guy he ended with in 1944, which was Harry Truman, who ended up taking office when FDR died. We're used to the idea that things are set in stone, but Donald Trump is actually the only person in recent history, color TV history, internet history, the stuff we know, the names we know. He's the only one to win the presidency with 2 different running mates. And it's because he had to run 3 times to win 2 races. But because of their DEI mindset, it's not history that said it had to be Kamala Harris. It's DEI that said that. And that's the problem with DEI. When you put the wrong person in a top job, what's going to happen when everybody needs to step up? You end up with the wrong person leading because they're there for the wrong reason. This isn't like Joe Biden set out to find the best running mate and decided that Kamala Harris was that person and I just happened to disagree with it. No, Biden narrowed his lens to a field of 3 or 4 candidates and went with the one who photographed best. It wasn't political savvy that got Harris on the ticket. She'd shown none in the 2020 primary. And actually, it was words that Harris spoke during that primary that lost her the election 4 years later. Remember all those commercials during football season? Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you. Remember that interview they use where she's sitting there being interviewed by what appears to be a 7-foot-tall cross-dresser, and that person's asking her about trans rights and medical transitions in the prison system. That's how far left. We're not just talking about should people be allowed to get this stuff, which I think should be the debatable point. She's talking about should taxpayers pay to get this stuff done in prison? As if there is a such thing as a sex change. As if there is any surgery that could be done that makes an A turn into a B. That makes a 1 turn into a 0. This doesn't exist outside of the fictional world of California. And it was in California that happened. So no, Harris didn't show any special chops. She actually set the context. She set herself up for her own demise with the answer she gave back then. And it wasn't political necessity either that got her on the ticket. California would vote for a corpse if it wore blue, and it did. It was DEI. And so it's not an exaggeration at all to say what I've said before. The death of George Floyd cost Gretchen Whitmer her best shot at the presidency. Let's say Whitmer gets picked in 2020 and George Floyd goes on to counterfeit another day, and everything else stays the same. If everything else stayed the same, Whitmer would have been Biden's replacement in 2024. It was DEI and the death of George Floyd that got us here. When Harris was elevated to the top of the ticket in 2024, what did Whitmer do next? She refused to join the ticket. Immediately, just as soon as it was announced almost, you think in your mind, okay, who could do this? You think, okay, maybe another top Democrat, a Gavin Newsom, a Gretchen Whitmer. And in the same headline, they announced that neither Whitmer nor Newsom would want to do it. Both had a ready excuse, Andy. I mean, who's going to ever elect two California Democrats to anything? That would look crazy. So Newsom had a nice hall pass. But Whitmer could say, well, who's going to elect two women to anything? Which would not show faith, which would not be an act of faith in either. Because if you're saying that America wouldn't have elected two women and you're one of the two women, you must think that America wouldn't elect you. Does anyone think Gretchen Whitmer thinks that? Of course not. So what she was saying by declining to run with Harris is that she didn't think Harris could win. I've been watching Whitmer since 2014 when she declined to enter the Michigan governor's race as Mark Schauer's running mate. Back then, the Democrats were facing an incumbent governor, Rick Snyder, and they struggled to even find a candidate. Mark Schauer had been in Congress. He volunteered as the sacrificial lamb, but Whitmer didn't join him on that limb. She stayed back, Schauer lost, and Whitmer won the governor's race for herself in 2018, 4 years later, when the seat came open. In a normal world, with a normal politician, you might expect Whitmer to seek a repeat of what she did a decade ago and win the White House for herself in 2028 when the seat comes open. But I don't see that. At a time when Whitmer should be making the most of her last 2 years in power, she hasn't chosen to stand up or stand out as a leader of the resistance to Trump. When Whitmer was in Washington last week, she sat next to Trump at the governor's dinner and then skipped out on Meet the Press. Whitmer's never done much for the Michigan media, but they're pathetic, so they love her anyway. They adopt her storylines without pushback. They write headlines in her voice, and in return, Big Gretch gives them absolutely nothing. No scoops, no access, not as much of a thank you. I think some of them are invited to the solstice party at the governor's house, but that's about it. And Tim Skubick, hey, congrats, Tim, on that end-of-year interview with Whitmer's dog. That was great stuff. Tim, let me know, should we send the Pulitzer to your home or your office? Just great stuff, hard-hitting journalism. Big Gretch doesn't reciprocate with the locals. She doesn't think she needs to. But she's always treated the national media special. She's always treated them differently because she's always seen it as useful. At least that was true when Whitmer had ambitions. That was true when Whitmer wanted the White House. But it's clear the disappointments of 2024 have taken a toll on her. After being passed over for the nomination, Whitmer's only notable contribution to the Harris campaign was her Dorito communion video, wherein she managed to piss off 2 million Catholics in Michigan without bringing in a single vote. Whitmer was not merely selfish and cynical that day. She was a bad teammate when Kamala Harris needed a good one. Trump ended up winning Michigan by 80,000 votes. And the House of Whitmer and the case for Whitmer and the idea that she's viable or valuable beyond Lansing and beyond right at that moment collapsed on that very day. Let's think about it. What does Whitmer have going for her going forward? 2020 was a long time ago. 2022 was a long time ago. Political chops? Have you guys seen her speak? Her team is so bad right now that when she croaked and choked her way through the State of the State address last night in Lansing, nobody bothered to get her a lozenge or a bottle of water. Every other week, Whitmer seems to travel to some foreign locale, supposedly for economic development, and return with the mystery illness. When Whitmer delivered her first State of the State, she wore a bright blue dress meant to draw in every eye in the room. And her seventh, as our friend of the show, Anna Hoffman, would say, Whitmer came dressed as a pothole on Michigan Avenue, which she described as resembling the surface of the moon. This is a woman who ran on fixing the damn roads. Big Gretch is just not that into us, Michigan. This we know. This we can sense. But if you read the signs, Big Gretch is just not that into politics either. She's waved the white flag on her future in politics, and she's hoping that somebody will see something and say something and alert her team. And so if you know Gretchen Whitmer personally, send her this podcast. Let her know that we see her for the namaste of it all. We see the real you, Gretch. We know you're the girl who gets drunk and passes out in the high school parking lot. We know you're the one who gives the Dorito communion the month before Election Day. And I know, and you know, that you are not a president of these United States. The Enjoyer podcast was the first in Michigan to tell you last year that Whitmer was running. We were the first to tell you that she was stumbling. And now today we're going to be the first to tell you the truth about Whitmer's future in politics. There ain't one. Don't believe me, just watch. As the signs mount, even Whitmer's hired help and her fan club in Lansing and the national media watching it all will have to admit the obvious truth. Gretchen Whitmer is done with politics.